Our next speaker is Mr. Nicholas Jones. He received his master's degree in material science and engineering from the University of Dayton. After working in mission performance analysis at the Missile Defense Agency, he currently works at the Scientific Test and Analysis Techniques Center of Excellence, STAT COE, in direct consultation with DoD programs. Mr. Jones assists programs with test planning and analysis and also supports STAT COE initiatives for model validation levels, MVLs, and development of STAT to support Cyber T&E. Let's welcome our speaker.
All right, thank you. And I'll start by apologizing to those of you who enjoyed all the math in the last two briefs, because there are no equations in my brief today. So I'll start by giving a brief outline of kind of what I'm going to talk about here. I'll give the motivation for this. I'll talk a little bit about mission-based risk assessment specifically as part of that motivation. I'll give an overview of exactly what I mean by a state transition map. Talk a little bit about a kind of focused objective with this, which is assessing mission resilience. And then we'll look at a notionalized case study application and some lessons learned. So the motivation here, as many of you are going to be well aware, DoD is working very hard to get better at quantifying risk and assessing resilience in a lot of different mission domains. One of the key missions in which that's really an emerging area of interest is cybersecurity and cyber resilience. Many of you are, if you're familiar with cyber, will be familiar with the idea of a MBCRA, mission-based cyber risk assessment. If you're not, that's something like a cyber tabletop or any of a number of similar types of activities that are used to kind of quantify or occasionally quantify, as more often decompose systems and understand some of the different things that feed into mission risk and mission resilience. So there are numerous methods that exist for that. There was a great series of papers that came out of IDA that talks about a lot of those different methodologies for doing MBCRA. And what we're looking at with this STAMP concept, state transition map, tentatively named STAMP. I know there's a few other things in this domain that kind of go by that name. So we're workshopping alternative names currently. But the idea here is this is meant to be a tool to help groups that are going through trying to assess resilience for a DoD system look at doing a better job, more systematic job of documenting their system functions, their threats, the different effects that those threats can have, identifying some targets for test, and in extension, this can directly support mission modeling. So a little bit for those who may not be familiar about mission-based risk assessment in general, the idea here is kind of built on, as I said, the concept of MBCRA. So there is a DoD cybersecurity T&E guidebook that is out, and DTE&A and DOT&E are currently working on a MBCRA appendix to that guidebook. That should be out later this year. So I've snagged this graphic from them, but it kind of walks through the process that they go through for gathering inputs to an MBCRA in terms of threat assessment, criticality analysis, characterization of the cyber attack surface, doing some preparation, which is a lot more of kind of the programmatic side of setting up to do this event, execution of the event where you actually bring your SMEs together, start documenting all these things and getting an understanding of what the impacts of the different threats you've identified might be for system resilience and how those things could be exploited. And then they're pitching this as an iterative process, or ideally an iterative process, where you gather the outputs from that event and feed that into further, more refined assessments of system resilience as you carry through the program. So the idea with what we're looking at here for mission-based risk assessment is essentially taking that same concept, but applying it in a domain that is not necessarily constrained to just deal with cyber effects. Because obviously resilience can be a huge issue with hardware systems as well. The idea of MBRA as a formal non-cyber activity isn't something that is currently covered by any formal DoD guidance. So we've kind of reached into a lot of the guidance that's out there for MBCRAs to try and apply this in a less constrained concept. So I'll give an overview of what the state transition map idea is here. So in essence, this is a tool to help decompose and document a system. So this is a very generic outline of essentially the structure of it, and I'll walk through a couple of examples to give you a little better feel for what's going on here. But essentially, the stamp is built in a way that it's meant to indicate the different states that the system can go into. So starting from normal states, and then essentially this is a kind of a shorthand way of denoting potentially a cyclical graph. So you'd start in a normal state, and I'll build this slide several times, but you'd start in a normal state on the left there. The state on the left indicates what state you're currently in. From there, you can either stay in your normal state, in which case you're in a loop there, or you can go to a state where you've had an exploit attempted. At that point, you go to that next state, and from there, you can either catch the exploit and return to normal, you can have another exploit attempted, or you can have the attack be successful, right? And then you'd go to the corresponding state from that point. If the attack is successful, you could do some kind of recovery actions, maybe you return to normal after that point. You may have another exploit attempted on top of that. You may have additional attacks executed based on the same exploit, or you may end up in a situation where you've been permanently compromised in some way. From there, again, if you're still operating, you might deal with additional exploits being attempted, additional attacks, and even additional compromises. So the idea there is that this is meant to be kind of a succinct way to capture a graph that could potentially have arbitrary degree of cyclicality to it. And it's intended to help guide people through documenting some of those different chains of things that can happen and denoting what the possible state transitions are. So any state that's colored in is a state transition or any box that's colored in denotes a state transition that can occur. And then they're color coded by level of consequence. And essentially that level of consequence is something that corresponds to what state you're going into. If you're going into a bad state, the worst state you're going into, the darker the box is. But the idea here is that this is meant to document this in a quick, easy to look at way, and help to think through the severity of some of these different state transitions to identify things that should be targets for controls or for test, and to potentially directly help support building state-based automata for mission modeling. So here's a notional example based on a USB threat in a secure area. So essentially at the first step, you start a normal operation. The secure area is operating under the presumption that the security in place prevents the USB from entering. But if that's not the case, USB enters. And from that point, we can transition to where either the USB leaves before use or where a USB gets used in a computer. If it's put in a computer, it can either be detected or not. If it's detected, we're going to presume in this example that it will be negated. If it's not detected, it can remain in that computer, or it can leave after being used, potentially with information on it. If it leaves, then you might end up with a spill situation. And in this case, negation of the threat at any point in that chain, we presume results in a return to the normal state. But if the spill is created, that would potentially trigger a totally separate process that could then be documented in a separate stamp if you so desired, that would deal with the damage control efforts there. Something that I've put in this example that's not in the previous one is in those colored boxes. You'll see some of those have question marks, some of those have numbers. Essentially, those are rough probabilities of transition, making that transition. In a first pass from like a cyber tabletop, that would have to be elicited from SMEs. The idea is that in that iterative MBCRA process, you would identify which of those are your critical transitions, and those become targets for test to better nail down what those probabilities actually look like, or to develop distributions for those probabilities. So in context of mission resilience, why are we talking about mission resilience with this? Well, resilience is defined as shown here by this presidential policy directive, but it's the ability to adapt to changing conditions and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. And one of the things that is critical about resilience is that it's something that occurs over time. You're not necessarily dealing with a single event or an isolated event or an event that you're going to have a chance to recover from before another event hits you. So the idea here is to try to grapple with a little bit, just guiding people through thinking about how far down that chain you have to look. If you run a system for long enough in a contested environment, it will fail eventually, right? Nothing is infinitely resilient. So this is to try and help people get a grip on that that idea and understand, that they need to think through how far can they maintain resilience. So resilience is a key focus for DoD software systems, but it's also a key focus for hardware systems. And in the effort I want to talk about here, what we did was working with a real DoD system, a real DoD program. We went through this exercise and built some of these out kind of as a proof of concept. So case study here, we applied this idea, this stamp concept, to an MBRA for a real DoD program, working with their SMEs with the goal of simply characterizing, well, not characterizing, but documenting the system resiliency in a contested environment. So they had several resiliency scenarios that they were really interested in. We constructed a stamp for each one of those. And these initial ones were really just focused around trying to capture those different functional states in normal and contested operation and the transitions between those, and then color coding those by the severity. Again, the initial goals for this were just on that documentation and planning side, with the potential that in the future maybe you could add some modeling capability to this, that you could use Monte Carlo or other methods to try to understand which states are absorbing states. For releasability reasons, both all of the information, the stamp that I'm going to show, and the actual system itself in this brief is entirely notional, but it's something that we're kind of using to capture some of the takeaways that came out of the effort that we went through. So, the first one, maybe the most important one, is that in a real system, and in particular when you have that cyclicality and that building up of effects over time, the states you've been through matter. There's a memory here. So this is not a Markov process because you have memory of where you've been. And it's not necessarily a for those who were in some of the briefs yesterday about Bayesian networks and directed acyclic graphs. This isn't necessarily that kind of a process either, because as we saw, there's a lot of cyclicality here. And in the case of any arbitrary system, there may be some cases where you can break this down as a kind of Bayesian network of Markov graphs, but I don't think that that's in general true. But for the system that we were looking at, we went through the effort of at least trying to document which of the state transitions would kind of trigger a memory effect where on the next iteration through the loop, you would have to be cognizant that your risks or your transition probabilities are different because of where you've been. The shorthand that we kind of developed for trying to notate that was essentially to have this secondary table. So in this case, we've got a notional radar system, and there are a couple of chains of effects through here. There are some physical effects and some high-level notional cyber effects. So this is a radar. At the top level, we've got going from normal, looking at a couple of different states of being jammed and some potential mitigating actions there. And then the potential state of having your ground system be denied service through some arbitrary vector, and some things that you could potentially do to try to cope with that. For the memory states, there are situations where as soon as you take that mitigating action or as soon as you've been affected there, suddenly you're operating in a different mode, and that changes your transition likelihoods the next time you come through the loop. So, in order to denote that, in this case, we've got that secondary table, like I mentioned, and essentially each time you pass a particular symbol, it denotes a shift in that memory state to the alternate from the normal. And then when you pass through the normal one, that's a shift back. And there is one here that actually has two different symbols. Essentially, that's meaning you're going back to normal if you're out of normal for either of these two. So in application, we found there was some utility here just for helping people think through, again, the depth of this. But we also found that there was some work to be done for making it intelligible to a broader and more high-level community. One of the big things that we found was that the OT community, a lot of the testers were more used to thinking in terms of ops cap. And so one of the things that we started to do was to go back through and look at, rather than having the specific functional level memories, which is maybe more useful if you're going to update your system design or figure out where you're implementing controls for for the OT community. It's probably also useful to have this kind of additional mask over the stamp of transitions in ops cap. And in this case, the symbols are used in a little bit of a different way, where we've got the typical red, yellow, green ops cap scale. If you go through a minus sign, that means you're going to less ops capable. If you go through a plus sign, it means you're going one step up the ladder of ops capability. And our OT folks found that to be fairly useful. One of the other things that we found was that when we first started this, the color scale here was fairly poorly defined as to what exactly those colors meant. So working with their engineers, we kind of nailed that down a little to the point where, the dark green is basically representing that we're operating completely normally. Light green is fully ops capable, but in an off nominal config. Going to yellow, we're somewhat degraded in system operation, but we're fully recoverable. So we're still kind of at the threshold where we're not losing capability permanently. And then in the examples or in the stamps that I worked with them, but not in this example, we did have some where we got to these last two states where essentially you're starting to degrade the system permanently, and even some transitions where you go through the black and you're completely losing some capability. And one of the interesting interactions there that was kind of eye-opening for some of the people we were working with, even the SMEs for the system, is there are situations where you can be partly mission capable but still have permanent degradation occurring, or be recoverable but still have no mission capability. So some of those interactions were things that stuck out to them as of interest for further study. So some lessons learned. This was kind of a first trial application of a high-level idea, unfunded, and One of the tricky things with this, this is something that would have been really great to do in SysML or similar. We didn't have the ability to do that in the enclave we were working in. But as far as actually building this out, whether you're going to do it in SysML, which would be a great way to do this, or in a spreadsheet, the way we actually did it, this is most effective as a collaborative, iterative effort where we have a lot of smart people in the room that we can bounce these things back and forth off of and update this. Currently, it's pretty labor intensive to do this because there are a lot of breakdowns, and with the multiple different threat types that you can have an effect on, in particular, a modern cyber physical system where you could potentially have both, and you can have physical effects that are cyber relevant, cyber effects that are physically relevant for resilience. You need to have all of that crosstalk and do this updating to make sure you're capturing those interactions. Something else we found was that a lot of those transitions can be very heavily dependent on warfighter TTPs. So if their tactics, techniques, and procedures dictate that when a defender notices a particular thing, they're going to take a particular action, that can have a big impact. The flip side of that is that this can be useful for identifying where it might be good to look at changing a TTP or updating a TTP to take better actions. Currently, the value of STAMP as an elicitation tool kind of depends on the level of knowledge that's already been gathered and is present in the room. But we did find it to be useful for documenting a lot of these interactions in a succinct way that we can take and kind of put on one slide and talk to somebody at a higher level and walk them through some of the key gotchas with the system. One thing that was a big takeaway from what we did that I suspect may be a takeaway in the room here is there's a fair amount of familiarization with this format and how to read it that's necessary to really make it easy to use. With the first slide that I threw up, I tried to put a whole lot of arrows on there that build to show you how to kind of walk through it, but it can be tricky. And the layout, there is a kind of general structure with a different with any given threat of kind of going from a normal state to a affected state to a response state to a resolution and then looping back through. But what specifically that looks like varies from system to system or indeed from scenario to scenario depending on what functions of a system we're dealing with. So there's some difficulty there. And then, adding, if you are going to take this to the next step and add those weights and try to do the Monte Carlo here, that is probably best done as a follow-up with a group that's familiar with the stamp so that at least you get through the effort of identifying what all those likely transitions are, and then you know where to focus your efforts afterwards. We found that it took quite a lot of effort just to map out which of those transitions were even possible. So opportunities for future work. One of the things that would really improve this a lot is having a better tool than Excel to build these in. So that's something that we would love to work on. Using those scaled numerical values in those different rows to kind of represent the state transitions as I discussed. Again, for simple situations, you may be able to use some Markov logic, whereas for others you might be able to use some Bayesian. And as I mentioned, for others, there are definitely going to be cases where you kind of it doesn't really fit into either of those constructs, and you have to use something that's a little different to get through this. But, applying that kind of modeling would help identify in a more rigorous way kind of what your critical state transitions are that impact resilience and should really be targets for tests to better understand them and for controls to limit ability of getting into those bad states. And in this case, you know, the thing that we did was a cyber physical system. There were a lot of physical threats that were very much of interest. We have not actually applied this to a pure cyber case yet, so that would be interesting to do. There may be other things that would pop out just because of the varied nature of a lot of the cyber threats that are out there. So my references, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Hello, Curtis Miller, an IDA research staff member. So I would imagine if I were to talk to, thinking about the cyber case in particular, you show these state transitions and also severity of being in a particular state. And I imagine if I were to talk to some of the cyber folks who I'm aware of, they'd have some concern about that. In particular, they'd say, well, it depends on what the adversary wants to do. Right. So, like, for example, you stick in the USB port, the USB stick, and do they want to exfiltrate data, or do they want to just stay there and monitor? Or maybe what they're doing is like they inject a worm that just starts causing problems for your network. It entirely depends on what it is they want to accomplish. So how then could, I mean, I really like this as a reporting methodology, and I really want to put numbers on these things, right? Because I'm a big fan of numbers. So how could I account for what would concern them, which is that this really depends on what they want to accomplish, right? And and all the different ways someone could do badness being in any particular state.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the main things here is that this is very much mission fulfillment focused, mission capability focused. So absolutely, in a cyber context, you could have an exploit executed that puts the adversary in attack posture, and then they just sit on that for an arbitrary time before they spring the trap, right? And this is as it's currently structured, doesn't necessarily capture that unless you explicitly build that sub-state in, and you could have your response mechanism there be the monitoring that hopefully is going to find that you've been exploited in that way. But as it's currently structured, this is really very much looking at kind of step changes in the actual mission operation. So it would definitely be something that would be of interest to us to kind of look at how we would build that out more. And one thing that's potentially worth noting here is for some of these different state transitions, you could take that transition and say, okay, well, this transition is enabled by a series of different events or a series of different steps, and you could potentially build this exact same kind of structure for everything that fits within one of those boxes. Mm-hmm. All right, tough crowd. Thank you.